Odor, don't touch it. Hearing, visualization, taste, with the world. These are our direct links with reality, our five senses. In a sense, it works like sensors that connect our brain to the outside world. But our brains interpret it so beautifully. It is as if with these senses we are directly connected to objective, clear, unadulterated reality. It sounds like, isn't it? So what we see, what we hear, without hearing it with my ear. We say we don't believe until we see it with our own eyes. Very much. But we have a lot of confidence. This is perhaps the biggest mistake of man. Our five senses are actually related to the complex reality of the external world. It makes for a very twisted connection. The actual reality is much more complex than we can perceive with our senses. And we can actually use this confusion to our advantage. And only by thinking. Yes, he can become a violin virtuoso just by thinking. He can make the carcass from where we sit. We can make seemingly impossible calculations in our minds. We can bend reality. A little far-fetched? I will tell you about some of the work in a moment. Reality can be bent a little more. If you're ready, let's begin. Our brain, which sits in the dark inside our skull, is the tainted electricity that comes through these senses, trying to interpret its signals to figure out what's going on. Then the neurons get to work and interpret what is happening and how we react accordingly. To understand what's needed, don't be misunderstood. This system is one of the most optimized, most efficient systems possible. Moreover, by ensuring that our ancestors were not eaten by savages, has done a good job. But we also know this. The human brain, with very simple optical illusions, with hallucinations, with different states of consciousness, and it's very easy to deceive. So it's actually a myriad of patches, imaginations, when our brain is creating a picture of the external world. And he resorts to fabrications, and in these fabrications he uses information about the human body that we can't even imagine. It creates changes. Example, let's take a look at some very strange experiments on how the human brain can be deceived. First of all, that in the 1980s the future of computers and almost everything else would be virtual reality. It was thought. Today when we think of virtual reality, we think of games, but it is really in the medical world. We see virtual reality applications. There is a type of treatment called VRT, virtual reality therapy. So virtual reality therapy. This treatment is usually neurophysiological, such as phobias, post-traumatic stress disorders. Problems, but the scope of this practice is much broader. For example, Hunter Hoffman, David Patterson, and Sam Sharar at the University of Washington. Named researchers have been using this VR treatment for severe burn wounds since 1996. Patients are also using it. You can imagine that these patients are in incredible pain. Pain is a neurological response directly linked to psychology. In fact, the placebo effect is often used in burn treatments. It is very important that the patient believes that the treatment will work. Especially in burn patients, the event that caused their burns is constantly flashbacks in their minds, and the intensity of the pain increases in direct proportion to this. The idea of these researchers was this: if we can convince patients that they are cold, their suffering will be reduced. Using a virtual reality game called Snow World for this is particularly painful, with the penguins traveling on the glaciers in this game during bandage changes, which is a process, and they were made to play and stuff like that. And indeed they said that they felt much less pain than in normal times. This is not only about the patient's feedback, but also the ephemerae made afterwards, and other imaging techniques. And that's not just with externally assisted equipment like this, but with all mental exercises. Valid. This is what the following experiments and exercises are all about. For example, there is a brain exercise that is widely used in Japan, a mental equivalent of the physical abacus as we know it. This technique is known as Anzan. We can say that it is a mental abacus and a practice to calculate quickly and accurately. In 2012, Naofumi Ugasawara became the world mental computing champion using this technique. Had happened, for example. People also show off their skills in a competition known as Flash Anzan. Here, the display momentarily shows 15 three-digit numbers. And the contestants remember these 15 numbers and use the abacus in their minds to find the shortest number. They try to collect it in time. And in this challenge, 15 contestants with some more than 3 digits can collect them in 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Isn't it incredible? Although it may seem like it, this actually shows us how far the limits of the human brain can be pushed, he says. And we can also see it in activities that require physical effort. Musicians, athletes, Normally, of course, for someone who plays an instrument, it's very good to have an instrument, right? But it seems that having a mental copy of the instrument can have the same effect. And musicians have been aware of this long before scientific research. For example, The Body Has a Mind 2007 by Matthew and Sandra Blacksley. In the book of its own, a violin virtuoso goes to prison for some reason. And this musician is in his mind every day without his violin during the 7 years he spent in prison. Practice. And on the evening of the day he was released, this violinist got his real violin without going to jail, and performs a violin recital that is much more spectacular than before. Her mental practice helps her to maintain and even develop her fine motor skills. Has been. The strange thing is this. You might think that these people are already musicians. It's easy for them to practice mentally. But a study by Alvaro Pascual-Leon from Harvard Medical School is also very interesting. It reveals something. Identify an experimental group of people who have never played a musical instrument before, just showing some finger movements on the piano and how to press the keys. And then he divides his group into two. And one group practiced on a real piano for 2 hours for a week while the other group practiced. He just wants them to mentally practice the piano. At the end of the study, imaging of the brains of the two groups showed both physical. That the same areas of the brains of both mental practitioners and mental practitioners change in the same way is being seen. It seems that the brain doesn't really understand the difference. If you can simulate the movement very strongly in your mind that you are really playing, your brain thinks. Finally, I would like to mention a more striking example. This time, it's about sports. In 2004, a group of researchers from the Cleveland Clinic Foundation began a study. Decides. Here's what they're trying to find out. The mental practice of a particular physical activity in that area of the body. Does it make a difference? So when you think you're training arm muscles, your arm muscles can actually develop. Is it? Isn't that ridiculous? That's not going to happen. Now here, 3 groups are identified. One group moves one finger left and right. The second group does nothing. The third group imagines moving their finger left and right. Yes. And the experiment continues for 12 weeks. The result of this experiment is really interesting. A 53% increase in finger strength in the first group that actually moved their finger. Observed, there is no change in this finger in the group that does nothing. In the fingers of those in the group who regularly imagine moving their finger, an average force increase of 35% is observed. They had managed to convince their brains that his finger was moving. And the brain had an appropriate physical response. Isn't it strange? Of course, this is not the only example. In 2007, a similar study was conducted in Canada, this time targeting the glutes. Here too, a group lifts weights and works on the glutes, and the result is a force increase of 28.3%. In the group who thought they were lifting weights and working the gluteal muscle, the average in the gluteal muscles, there is a 23.7% power increase. Isn't it strange? When you train your brain correctly, you can create in your mind a perfect representation of real physical activity. When you can create a simulation of it, your brain rings it as reality. Not only that, it creates physical changes in your body accordingly. This connection is precisely the physical changes that occur with these mental exercises. How it happened is still a mystery, by the way. Neuroscientists are still investigating this. But in a nutshell, this and countless other examples tell us one thing. We don't use our brains well enough. We can actually fool this. When the motor neurons in our brain can get enough electricity from our mental exercises to their millions, and strengthens the muscles in our bodies. But as we said, the details of this are still not clear. Yet it is clear that only our imagination can produce results that are not at all imaginary. Even if there is no prescription for this yet, it is one of the most important lessons we should take from this. And one of them is this: you are much more than what you are now. And it organizes your world of thought and imagination correctly. You can direct your thoughts correctly both in your own body and in your life. You can witness incredible changes. And as always, until we meet again, I'm glad you're here. Love.